Hello, in this discussion we're going to look at nukes and crisis bargaining. What is crisis bargaining? Well, there's three components for the definition. The one that I want you to focus most on is bargaining under a threat, so that there's a time pressure, there's a dispute that's ongoing, and engagement that has to happen. Now, this particular article, I'm going to highlight everything that I think you need to know from it. It is excellently done, but more nuanced than many of the articles that we study. And so because of that, I will tell you the other areas that you need to focus and the key points to take away from it. The authors argue that coordinated action is about dividing the gains from joint action. That's just what bargaining is. Well, crisis bargaining and nukes, they argue that nukes change the nature of that bargaining because of nuclear capability's destructive capacity, which honestly makes a ton of sense. We think about uncertainty and commitment problems. So this article, there's background information that you're expected to have when you read it. When we think about the overall just basics of the bargaining model for war, think about Fearon and Schultz and Powell and so many others. We think about, in this context, how uncertainty can lead to war. Here we want to especially emphasize overestimation of one's own abilities, the resolve of an opponent, and an opponent's abilities. Because this is where nuclear weapons may dramatically shift the bargaining range. If you are not a nuclear power and you're going against a nuclear power, well, it's really hard to overestimate your own abilities because, well, they have a nuke and you don't. What if you're a nuclear power? Are you really willing to use it? So there's a couple paragraphs in here that you should pull out that we talk about on the next slide that maybe nuclear weapons aren't as effective as they want because they don't change the bargaining range as much. Finally, we think about how conflict can occur, not by information asymmetries or uncertainty, but by commitment problems. So as discussed in other places in classes that I teach, remember that commitment problems is the inability for parties to create essentially contracts that are enforceable at the international level. So this goes all the way back to anarchy, a system where states are sovereign, that there are commitment problems. You can't trust follow through, you can't trust other negotiations or the statements of other states, right? Because of anarchy, there's no way to enforce that. Part of what overcomes commitment problems in domestic business and even international business is the force of law, and that contracts can be extraordinarily specifically stipulated, and they are. So how do we think about nukes and influencing this bargaining range? Nukes affect the expected costs of conflict. Okay, so I think that they do an excellent job, given 3 or 4 paragraphs with lots of research that kind of demonstrates that nukes change the nature of conflicts. So we think specifically about crisis bargaining with a country like North Korea. Is it different than bargaining with a country like Iran? One has a nuclear weapon, one has a nuclear latent capabilities, right? Versus like Iraq versus Libya, right? Neither one had nuclear weapons or nuclear capability really, but there is a perception difference. Okay, so what I want you to kind of think through though, because I do think we take that for granted, that's established in the literature, it's basically the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy on non-proliferation, but think about the quote that's on the slides from Mueller and Geller. Mueller's argument in particular is nuclear weapons are irrelevant because they're not used. You can't credibly threaten, we're going to nuke you. There's a normative, the strength of the normative restraint on nuclear use. Well, we've not seen a nuclear weapon used since 1945. Surely there are cases where nuclear powers were severely threatened, whether this is Pakistan or India or China over territorial disputes, or Israel over territorial disputes. The nukes, I don't know if nukes were threatened, but maybe classified settings, but they certainly weren't used. So do they actually change the likelihood of conflicts or of the bargaining range? So this is where it's important to think about the probability of full escalation. What the authors argue is that the probability of full escalation under the shadow of nuclear weapons is lower than conventional versus conventional forces, but the costs are so great. Okay, so this is that low probability, high damage event that we talked about earlier. There is the likelihood that you move to full escalation, so in this context would be using all of your military capability. The likelihood of doing that is extremely low when you have nuclear weapons, because that means using the nuclear weapons. But the costs are greater for their use. As we think about coercion, and what can that mean? Well, what the authors argue is that nuclear states should prevail in coercive diplomacy. Right? You can either gain concessions or having an opponent back down, particularly when it's asymmetric, when it's a nuclear power versus a non-nuclear power, right? Because of these higher costs. So they also investigate it, similar to Horowitz, in a dyadic structure, because it's important to know if you have a relationship between country A and country B, who in that dynamic has a nuclear weapon. Right? It's not enough to just say the dyad has it. Who started the crisis and who wins the crisis? Well, we need to know who within that has the nuclear weapon. Okay, the dependent variables, the international crisis behavior. They have a variable for the victor in terms of realizing gains. That's the standard measure. But there's a second one that I want to spend a little bit more time on because it's much more nuanced to understand. And that's if compromise occurs or it involves revised terms, the authors count that as a win for the challenging state. Okay, so if we go way back to our theory of maintenance and change, what the authors here are arguing is that as you change, if there is a revision of the status quo or compromise in the status quo's favor, right? So maybe a challenger arises, but it doesn't change. The state that maintained the status quo won that engagement, right? Because they didn't want it changed. Now, this can be potentially endogenous. And what we mean here is that co-production. If you have a nuclear state, they may make greater demands, which should, without the nuclear capability, decrease the likelihood of achieving those outcomes. But because they have the nuclear capability, they're more likely to achieve it. But they never would have asked for it without nuclear weapons. So that's endogenous. So the compromise or the outcome is endogenous. It's partly produced because of the nuclear weapons. If you don't account for that, your results can be biased. Okay, so this would, in health research, this would be something like I'm studying heart disease, but I'm not looking at smoking. Well, smoking may cause heart disease, and smoking is a comorbidity with heart disease, so it needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, you might be finding all kinds of heart disease issues, but you're actually missing something. Okay? So what they do is say, okay, if these things are kind of co-producing each other, we can look for compromise as a way to revise terms as a victory. Okay, this also goes to strategic selection, which says nuclear states, or really any state, should only play to win. Right? You shouldn't be making challenges in the international system or escalating crises that are not part of your national security strategy and where you're likely to lose. Right? The way to think about this in very crude terms is who picks a fight with a bully that you're going to lose to? Right? Over something you don't care about. Well, okay, so all of those go away. That's kind of strategic selection. What they really mean here is that nuclear states and non-nuclear states are going to identify when the outcome of a crisis is already determined, or not predetermined, but preponderance of power, the nuclear capability will overwhelm the other person, so they just capitulate right away, right? Without adjusting for that scenario, and they do it with what's called the Heckman selection model. If you don't adjust for that, you bias the results. So a simple way to think about the strategic selection is once a crisis has begun, it's already selected into it. we want to be able to capture what happens before that selection so we can really see the effects of the nuclear outcome. So it's a two-stage model where you first have to engage in a crisis behavior, and then you predict the likelihood of the outcome. That's what they do in that Heckman model. So think two stages, almost as a filter. I mean, it's a selection, so it's a filter, to ensure that we're capturing the dynamic that they want to capture. Okay, the results section, here's what I will say to that. You need to know the theory of this argument and the points made in this discussion, so selection effects, why they need to be dyadic. Right? This results section is much more complicated than most. And so there are no questions on the exam specifically to this results section. How do you interpret this variable? Or this is statistically significant, how does that affect? But I am telling you, if you have made it this far in the class and you've made it through this far in the lecture, that on the exam, you will be required to examine substantive results across articles. So read the substantive sentences and components of this article and be able to articulate it in conjunction with other articles. There will be a question that says, okay, we've read all this stuff, whether it's private security companies or nuclear politics, what does any of it mean? Right? You need to be able to answer that using substantive results. I hope that's helped. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.